Welcome to AEC Unscripted M&A Edition, your go-to podcast for unfiltered conversations and expert analysis. Brought to you by Stanbaugh Ness.
Welcome to AEC Unscripted. I'm your host, Jeff Adams, the Director of Mergers and Acquisitions at Stanbaugh Ness. Today, I'm coming to you from Atlanta, Georgia, and we're going to be exploring M&A through a different lens, and that is of a couple of technology experts. I've served in the C-suite of an AE firm in my past, and I know what it's like to think about bringing technology and any individuals, for that matter, into the M&A conversation. We tend to want to keep things on a need-to-know basis. Well, today we're going to be talking about why technology is a need-to-know area when it comes to mergers and acquisitions. I'm delighted to have joining me today for this episode Phil Keeney and John Honodel, two of Stanbaugh Ness's own technology consultants who have assisted AEC buyers and sellers in addressing technology challenges before, during, and after an M&A transaction. Phil and John, thank you so much for joining me today. Tell our listeners a little bit about yourselves.
Go ahead, Phil.
Hey, happy to be here, folks, and appreciate Jeff having us on the call. I am calling in from St. Augustine, Florida. I've been with the firm for around 11 years now, and my role is managing director of our technology team. In my role, I assist clients in navigating the complexities of IT and mirroring the IT function with business and helping elevate that business moving forward and create levels of profitability where they may not have seen before or recognize where those profitabilities could come from.
Thanks. Hi, John Honodel. I hail out of Waynesboro, Pennsylvania. Been with the firm 5 years. I provide CIO services for our clients, strategic analysis, looking to the future. It's a strength of mine to vision what's to come. Revolve a lot of my work around budget analysis, so that's often pretty helpful for clients of ours.
We're going to jump into $1 million question right out the gate here, and that is, should IT have a seat at the M&A table and why? Phil, you want to kick that one off?
Absolutely. So when we think about IT, right, the days of old, right, going back years ago, IT has typically been looked at as a cost center. They're not really profit or revenue generating. Fast forward to today, folks understand that technology drives the business forward, okay? Having IT at the seat from an M&A perspective or from any perspective, having IT at the seat at the table allows them to help understand the business and help understand what tools and technologies can be put in place to drive that business forward. I've seen so many times where leadership will sit at a table and they will make decisions based upon what they think they know should happen. And they're looking at the numbers. And then they come back and tell IT, hey, here's what we've decided. Please put this in motion. And then IT has to figure out, and they're sitting there scratching their head and they're like, who came up with this? Did they even think about the process and the costs associated with it? Not only the direct cost of whether it be a tangible hardware, software, but the labor effort. I'm going to have to spend a lot of time developing this or putting something into place that may not have been the most beneficial to the firm. So IT needs to have a seat at that table, if nothing else, to listen for opportunities to say, hey, you know what, that doesn't quite make sense, or we need to look at this, because they're evaluating things from a risk perspective as it relates to legacy IT, cyber risk. So it's important to have folks at the table.
All right, as I'm hearing that, Phil, I think about what I've seen happen in firms before, and things always get thrown back at IT, right? I mean, like you said, you're brought in late in the game on a lot of different topics, and you guys always seem to figure it out. Isn't that what IT does? You just figure things out, right? You take a mess and make music out of it. John, what's your thoughts? Why not just drag IT along?
Well, I think if you give us an opportunity to come in and advance the closing of a deal, you give us an opportunity to help assist with preventing costly oversight, if you will. Technology, security are all high on the list of risks. And when you think about even something as simple as just an analysis of what hardware exists as part of the deal. It could be older hardware or it could be fairly new and fresh and of no concern. I seriously think a lot of this has to do with cost analysis and knowing full well what to expect after the deal is done.
So I
And
hear you on that. Oh, go
Jeff,
ahead, Phil.
just a little context there too. And I've seen this recently where an organization will look at acquiring a firm, okay? And they'll look at all the numbers, they'll do their own little risk review. But instead of bringing IT in, they make these acquisitions, and it'll come to find out these other firms have differing ERP systems or accounting systems. And you have to figure out, are you going to leave that stuff alone? Are you going to be a branded house, a house of brands? You're going to let folks run as they are, which letting folks run as they are is an IT nightmare in itself. But just having someone there from a tech perspective to say, okay, you know what? Those folks are running this system. We're running this system. How do we blend them together? Ultimately, for a roll up for better financials and reporting out of disparate systems. And to John's point, too, you look at software and hardware and legacy, depending upon the size of the firm and the magnitude of what that firm has deployed, those costs can be pretty astronomical, several $100,000 in additional expense. That could be a negotiating tool, right? If you're looking at it and say, you know what, you've got a lot of legacy stuff here, end of support, end of life, and for us to acquire you or merge or whatever it may be, that equates to risk, right? When you hear
Absolutely, yeah.
legacy, that's unsupported typically. It equates to risk, and you have to mitigate, you have to manage it. I always say, even if it's just IT adding their 2 cents, so many folks think of IT as nerds and engineers, right? These tech folks that just sit there and that to your point earlier, right? We give it to you and you make it work. That's what we're good at.
Yeah.
But folks like John come in and have a different perspective and help understand the tech and the business and the budget and the total cost of ownership.
Phil, you mentioned something there about the size. And obviously, when you're doing a big deal, if you're going through a big acquisition, I think the tendency is to think, let's get all hands on deck. Let's look at it from every angle, including IT. I think it's the smaller deals that buyers tend to take a little different approach. For IT example, I hear buyers all the time say, well, it's a small firm. I'm just going to pull them over into our system. We're going to do away with everything they've got, their systems, their servers, their computers. We're going to give them all new computers, put them on ours. And I think there's sometimes a tendency there to say, we'll just tell IT what to do on day one, what we need of them. What would you say to that?
And I'll jump in here quick, and John certainly chime in, but those are typically easy. And I don't want to say easy, right? But I get that's the mindset for some of those firms, right? Hey, you know what? We're acquiring a 15, 20, 30 person firm. We're rolling it under. We're not really going to give those individuals, that organization, a choice, right? We're going to deploy all new tools, our entire stack. But then you also have to think about culture. Those are things that we also think about from a tech perspective, that change management, right? When you start going in and just forcing folks to make that change of new tools, new way of doing things, new process, what about an exit, right? What if you have key folks from that organization exit the firm that have what we call keys to the kingdom in the tech world? They have the intimate knowledge of how things typically run. So it's taking into consideration all things, not just the tech part of it, not just the budgetary piece of it, but also the people behind it. Focusing on the culture is important as well. You have to get buy-in.
I agree.
So we're talking a lot from the buyer perspective. I guess while we're on that, obviously you guys are saying get IT in there sooner rather than later. At what point in the M&A process would you say IT should be brought in on the buy side?
Yeah, I think we've already alluded to C-suite not really wanting to show cards early on. It's going to be confidential in nature as this unfolds. We get that. I think at some point when a confidentiality agreement is signed, we bring IT into the fold. whatever stage that is, Jeff, right? I mean, I know you carry it through multiple stages from beginning to end. IT needs to come in fairly early on. And again, in particular, if the agreement's signed, it's time to take a look, then bring us to the table. Let's get talking. If there's IT departments on both sides, be nice to introduce the two, knowing full well that they can't talk about it. Get the buyer side IT going out and looking at seller side infrastructure to figure out what they're going to be bringing into the fold. Size aside, you may find that the seller has some pretty nice systems that you had to weigh out whether you're going to keep what you have as the buyer or you're going to pick up what the seller has. So it could be mutually beneficial in nature. And I think earlier the better. That way you're going into the agreement with your eyes wide open.
Okay, that makes sense to me. I mean, let's flip the script here from a seller viewpoint. The seller's in a position where they're being more responsive to what the buyer's asking and wanting to do. Is there any reason on the sell side to bring your IT team into the conversation earlier rather than later?
Yeah. I think when you're being bought, there's a lot of anxiety associated with that. So I think about the people involved with it, right? And Phil mentioned change management. That's so huge. Letting that staff know what's going on in advance. They can also assist with the process to avoid any potential pitfalls if they're involved in the infancy of the process. In all fairness to the seller, too, they want to be reassured that things that carry over are going to be managed well. So it behooves them to know what's going on buyer side, what's going to look like, how can they support the process, right? Just from an IT staff perspective alone, I mean, bringing them into the fold early on and getting everybody talking, they could certainly pave the way for a smooth transition. Keep them in the dark and hit them with it towards the tail end of the process. Trust me, they're going to be shocked and they're probably not going to respond very well.
All right. So, Phil, let me ask you this question. A buyer, when you're going in and assessing a target company from an IT perspective, what are some of the main areas that buyers should be assessing? What else should they be looking at?
So the first thing that we do is we go in and we perform what we call a gap review or gap analysis.
Okay.
And you're looking at all things from everything that relates to security, the risk posture, okay? Cyber liability insurance, past claims that may have happened, what were the cause of those claims? And again, not that those claims hold a whole lot of weight, if you will, but it's okay. You want to learn from the mistakes and have they closed those gaps? For example, was a cloud server compromised at one point in time? What did they do to fix it? What was part of that compromise and what was the remediation that followed through? But you're evaluating the technology, right? Hardware, software, accounting systems, cyber posture. Do they have logging tools in place? They're evaluating technology, but then it's also asking the question of, does that firm have any clients that require compliance? Are they evaluating existing contracts that are in place? For example, we worked through with the customer made an acquisition, and then come to find out, that customer is doing work with DOD or something on the government level, the federal level, which requires them to have layers of NIST 171 or a ISO 27001 audit completed, or even leveling up to CMMC. So evaluating contracts as well is very, very important. The last thing you want to do is acquire a company. Everything looks great. 2 months into it, you're finding out that these contracts the folks are bidding on, they're not checking the appropriate boxes. So it's very important to make sure that they're doing that due diligence in advance.
You mentioned cyber several times in that response, and you mentioned the cybersecurity insurance that firms will have a lot of times in place. But talk a little bit about how, when a buyer is considering the cyber risk, how insurance alone is really not enough. What should they be looking at this time, and what's the buyer's responsibility from a cybersecurity risk standpoint?
When I think about cyber risk, right, cyber liability insurance is only one facet, right? That's going to cover to a certain extent. And some folks, so let me back up a minute, right? Some folks just have professional liability insurance. making an assumption that professional liability insurance is going to cover a portion of, or maybe hopefully cover a portion of, any event that there's a breach. No. Make sure that organizations have a cyber liability policy in place, and that's evaluated based upon their business needs. But one of the things that's very important, and I did this in a presentation yesterday as part of AEC Virginia, when we look at cybersecurity risk to resilience, it's making sure that firm, when you're going in to evaluate, you're evaluating the perimeter of that organization. You're evaluating the ability to recover for that organization. So their business continuity plan, their disaster recovery planning. So there's also a lot that comes into play here, that continuity piece that allows businesses to run. And in the event that there is a breach, it allows them to be up and running in a respectable time, depending upon the amount of data that needs to be restored, et cetera. All that comes into play, which falls into alignment with cyber liability insurance. What does cyber liability insurance? Will it cover a certain level of a breach? How much will it cover? Even too, when you think about there's an organization where there was compromise of hardware, so they were social engineering, hardware was compromised, right? It was phishing, hardware was shipped out, etc. Cyber liability insurance wouldn't cover that because it wasn't part of the cyber liability policy. And again, there's some language in there that defined specifically what wasn't covered. So something for folks to consider when you're looking at risk. Evaluate the liability policies as well, because you're acquiring that firm, right? So you're not only acquiring the firm, you're acquiring. I always go back to risk, right? For me, that's easy to quantify. I immediately say, okay, if I'm acquiring or merging, I think I have my house in order, but I don't know about the other firm, the relationship I'm getting into. I want to make sure that I'm running through all of my due diligence, a gap analysis, policy reviews, contract reviews, to make sure I'm reducing my risk for that acquisition.
And I know people structure deals in one of two ways. There's either stock purchases or asset purchases. And I think a lot of times people think if I'm doing an asset purchase, I'm able to limit those liabilities and risk maybe that I'm taking. But, really an asset purchase is carving out the existing known booked liabilities that are being avoided, but the day-to-day risk and liabilities that continue to play due to the processes or the lack of adequate processes is something every buyer's taking on day one. I mean, that you're buying, that's an inherent part of the business that you're taking on. So Phil, you mentioned earlier about client risk. You mentioned NIST, and some of those other things. Can you elaborate a little more on what are some of the client risks that a buyer should be looking at when they're focused on acquiring a target and doing their due diligence?
Yeah, so when we think about frameworks, because when I mentioned NIST 800-171 or ISO 27001, even SOC or CMMC, any of the other compliance frameworks out there, the risk from a buyer perspective is ensuring that if that organization, the client side or the seller side, if they're acquiring from that customer, making sure they're doing due diligence and evaluating the agreements that are in place, the contracts that are in place. Because if not, if that customer, if that buyer acquires another firm, and if they have contracts in place that require them even handling what they call CUI, which is the information there, the classified information that aligns with Department of Defense, DoD work, that organization, that buyer now possibly needs to, as an organization, adhere to CMMC. So it's very important for the buyer to understand from a contractual standpoint the risk that they're putting themselves into if their customer or the organization they're merging or buying and the clients that are associated with that customer are requiring any type of compliance. Because that compliance not only stays with that firm now, when they're acquired or rolled up to another firm, it is that entire, I call it an enclave, right? It's that entire infrastructure that now may need to adhere to certain levels of frameworks. Several years ago, right before CMMC rolled out, and I'll focus on CMMC in the moment, but CMMC or with NIST 800-171, it was from a security and a risk standpoint. There was a thing called self-attestation. We're all familiar with self-attestation, where folks go in, you check boxes. Well, when DoD, and it's primarily where it came from here, when they were reviewing and saying, you know what, I'm not sure and I will just put it out there. I'm not sure folks are 100% truthful in their answers. And we want to make sure that we are shoring up our contracts and the way that we do business and tightening up security and reducing risk. We're now going to require a third-party audit, which hence then rolled out the next layer, which is CMMC. So I've seen it more even now. It's not just years ago. I don't even want to say years ago, but it used to be geared towards manufacturers, right? Doing some widgets, munitions, military, whatever it may be for the DoD. But now it's even to architectural and engineering firms. We're receiving in the past 2 years, we do maybe 8 to 9, sometimes a dozen assessments or audits a year where clients are coming to us in the architectural engineering space and saying, look, we're seeing a lot of our contracts state NIST 800-171. There's language in there about 800-171 or CUI, and they're starting to see these things. And now the wheels are turning and saying, hey, we need to really engage IT and have them an intricate part of these conversations. Because before, the contract folks, they're just signing hey, everybody wants revenue. So they're out there, they're signing contracts. They get $1 million RFP or an RFQ come through the door. They're bidding on it, but they're not rolling in IT or a compliance officer to evaluate what's stated in that contract that could hold them liable for what they're signing. And now it's actually rolling up to legal, and legal's reviewing some of those contracts. And they're like, whoa, hey, we need to pause a moment here and truly evaluate, because we are now liable for contracts that have been signed. And folks, like, it's real. We're engaged with it now. And some people are like, I don't know. We have customers now, folks that have reached out and they're like, hey, we're signing contracts. We think we need to be a little bit more in alignment with the 110 controls of NIST and even leveling up the CMMC. Please help us get there. We need to be there now because we have a contract we signed and it starts in 2 weeks. So I know that was long-winded there, but it all comes down to the buyer side and risk and evaluating contracts from what the client side may have in place.
Yeah, no, that's helpful.
Seller
John,
side, I was going to say seller side might lose a contract if buyer side's not prepared to handle the security risk.
100%.
absolutely.
And I know there's some ways, and we don't have enough time to talk about it in this session, but there are definitely some ways to isolate that, to segment, if you will, right? You could keep that separate from other areas of the business in many cases. So it doesn't necessarily mean you have to have widespread compliancy throughout the organization. If you handle it properly from a technology perspective, you can, prove those requirements through segmentation of the network, as an example.
I think that was a great call out there, John, because if a buyer is looking at getting into a different service line or market sector that they're not as familiar with,
Right.
that's another reason to say, hey, better get IT in here, really looking at that and evaluating and talking with the seller's IT team and really understanding what are those special circumstances that the buyer may not be completely educated around.
It's a good point. You talked about timing earlier, when to bring IT to the table. If these things can be recognized up front, certain aspects of the merging of systems, if you will, integrations could be delayed as a result.
Absolutely. John, I know we've worked on a few deals together where you've come in and performed technology assessments on behalf of our clients and come in and basically create a document that you hand over to them that says, here's everything you need to know about the seller's technology, hardware, software, cyber risk, everything, and basically hand them a day one integration plan. But I also know there's a lot of times you get brought in separately, whether it's a deal that I've been working on, or you just get brought in for another SN client that had something going on. They've gone through a deal, did an acquisition, and now have a handful of problems that they need you to come help solve. What are some of those common technology pitfalls or oversights that you've been seeing out there in the AE industry when it comes to mergers and acquisitions?
Well, I think in general, it's just being blindsided after the fact and not taking into account something. You fill in the blank. It could be aged hardware, it could be lack of security, it could be an issue with IT staff. You just never know what you're going to run into until you have somebody actually perform the interviews, speak to these people one-on-one. We have some tools in our arsenal that allow us to do a quick analysis of their environment, some scanning tools, if you will, that will go in there and provide us a really nice report on anything from the number of endpoints to the number of servers to the number of user accounts, security groups, so forth and so on. All those things are nice to know up front. I don't know that there's any one particular item that's just going to blow a deal from an IT perspective, right? For an organization that truly wants to merge forces, whether they're buying, selling, what have you. So what's nice to do is come in early, do the assessment, benchmark it. Mergers and acquisitions take a while. If we recognize something needs worked on, we can work on it in the meantime. Maybe we look at it again a month down the road, 2 months down the road. That's one of the best parts about our analysis is we can provide a report that shows where they were and how far they've come and where we would expect them to be in the future. And when it comes to security standards, as an example, like Phil was talking about, they might not be there yet, but we'll know where they're going to be in a couple months. We can work through that to fix things before it's all brought together even.
Mm-hmm. Well, what are some of the war stories you guys have seen or heard that have happened because a buyer and or seller did not do adequate due diligence prior to the sale, and now all of a sudden here they are post-closing dealing with a major problem? Any war stories there?
Phil, you probably have several.
Two of the largest ones that I'll throw out there is accounting system integration is number one. Let's just say, for the sake of AE world, right? You get a vision, you get a vantage point, and then you're acquiring a client that may have QuickBooks running, or it may have BusinessWorks or something else. And the system's nice, right? More frequently than not, what we've seen too is some of those smaller firms, they don't have updated support for their ERP system. So let's just say a buyer's coming in, they're going to acquire a firm, and their accounting system is humming along, but it hasn't had paid support for the past 3 years. Trying to move that data and integrate it is typically a nightmare because you don't have versions you can jump up. Integration's never smooth, seamless. Your loss of data is another big factor in there. So the integration of accounting systems or ERP systems is huge. But even too, data sprawl. I know we had one of our guys that did a road show with Wayne Owens on our team and throughout Texas and Oklahoma City. And the biggest thing that continued to come up with the firms they've interacted with when talking to C-suite is we have an issue with data sprawl. We have data in Bentley ProjectWise. We have data in Panzura, Nusani. We have data in Teams and in SharePoint, all over the place. And it's not only data sprawl, where the data is in multiple places, but it's also classification of that data. How sensitive is it? Who has access to it and the permissions associated with it? Last thing you want to do is do an acquisition and merge all that information. And what if somebody has access to something they shouldn't, right? PII, PHI. I mean, it just opens up a can of worms. So it's very important to evaluate the structured data or the lack of structured data pre-acquisition in there as well. But those, for the top two that I see, is just accounting system integration and then data sprawl or data integration are nightmares. A lot of effort goes into it.
John, anything you would add to that?
I'd agree with the data sprawl. From an IT perspective, that's huge. If a lot of the infrastructure's on-prem, as an example, if you have two organizations, they're leveraging in-house infrastructure to store their data. How do you get those two systems together? Do you connect them through VPN, allow both sides to get access? You're going to have potentially multi-discipline organizations. Maybe there's a discipline on one side but not the other, and they're trying to cross that over, make that bridge. How do you do that from a data perspective comes to mind. This might also be a perfect opportunity to avoid the complexity of it and possibly look at a cloud solution. So you think about data consolidation. If it's on-prem, maybe some of it's out in the cloud, maybe some of it's in SharePoint. There's definitely services out there that provide some pretty excellent file storage, data storage structures in the cloud that, suit even the extreme needs, like an engineer or an architect. that's used to just going into the system and double clicking it and the file opening up in the native software. Well, guess what? There's solutions out in the cloud now that can perform that action. So I don't know, maybe it's not as much of a pitfall because any resistance can be looked upon as an opportunity to make change. And it might be a good time just to rethink things
Hmm.
and look more towards cloud solutions. And quite frankly, as I said, from a strategic perspective, a lot of things are going on in the cloud more so than on-prem. It's like the old analogy that, why use a spade to dig in the earth when you've got a perfectly good hydraulic backhoe sitting right there? Let's get in the backhoe, right?
Absolutely. Phil, you mentioned a while ago the two terms branded house or house of brands. From an IT perspective, how do you guys look at this? Do you have a preference of one over the other? Is there something you would advise? How would you advise a buyer to look at that and possibly set up their organization?
Yeah, so man, I tell you, I know sometimes it sounds easy to get through the transition and leave the house of brands as you are, right? Leave the company stand alone and let them run IT. Man, it is a IT management nightmare. Okay. I've been through this with several other organizations where you have an IT director, a CIO of the firm that's acquiring. Okay. So they're the buyer
Hmm.
and they have process and standards across the board and they're dialed in and they acquire 2, 3, 4 smaller firms that may have outsourced IT or they may have a small IT shop in house. The processes aren't dialed in. They don't have reporting tools or metrics to be able to report on ticket history, efforts, utilization in certain areas, RTO and RPO, recovery time, recovery point objectives there for backup and recovery, and allowing those firms from a house of brands perspective to continue to run standalone. As an IT director or CIO, I'd be pulling my hair out because how do I manage that organization? How do I have them roll up? How do I push our standards in place? And again, it goes back to reducing risk. Okay.
Hmm.
So having that organization come in, the buyer come in and implement their process and their standards. And we're working through this with another firm where they're going to put a set rule of standards in place. Every acquisition, man, we come in, we've got our own cybersecurity tool set stack we put in place, our own ticketing system, our own ERP system. They may allow that firm to have 3 or 4 items out of that initial core stack that they
Hmm.
allow them to choose what to do. Outside of that, everything else rolls up to the parent. I call it the parent firm. And that's the best case scenario when you think about reducing risk, managing financials, managing profitability, managing life cycle, right? Asset life cycles, software life cycles, integration of systems. It's so much easier to manage going forward. And I tell folks, I'm like, hey, even when we look at Stanball Nest from a tech perspective, we try to put ourselves in the same position. Hey, if I was a firm that was coming in, and think about from a buyer perspective, right? Whether it's PE backed or not, folks want to look at operational efficiency. And if they're looking from a PE perspective, if it's a 3-year, 4-year, 5-year rollout, somebody else is going to come in and buy. If I were that PE firm coming in to make that, you know what, I'm going to acquire this branded house in 4 years. And man, like everything, processes in place, everybody's on the same systems. Man, we got refresh cycles, software life cycles in place, process and governance, data's in 1 or 2 locations, not disparate all over the place. For me, I'll pay more for that, right? My multiple is going to increase. And that's what we try to help clients go through. And I tell all of our folks who we interact with, I said, my job, John's job, our team's job from a tech perspective is to come in and make that company the best company it can be, whether it be profitability, process efficiency, IT efficiency. So at the end of the day, what's the end goal? To sell, whether that's a sale internally, the current owners, they sell off their shares, they create an ESOP or private equity. The goal is to make money so they can sail out and retire. Our goal is to make that dream come true where they can cash out with a good amount of money.
Well, and that disparate systems approach you're talking about, there's a lot of hard work to unify that and get everyone on the same system. And there's value in that hard work, right? In the eye of the beholder later on.
Yeah.
And your
Jeff,
response is very similar to the way I would think about it, putting my former CFO hat on, that knowing I have consistent financial statements, consistent accounting processes that are in place. Same type thing. Without that, is how, yeah, I can create a template in Excel or something and force everybody to morph their financial reporting into this Excel file, but that's a very labor intensive, manual, unreliable process at the
Yeah.
end of the day. So even when I'm trying to compare all the different brands against each other, I don't even know if I'm comparing apples to apples for sure.
and
Yeah.
Jeff, the thing you think about too is FTEs, your full-time employees that are part of that. The more disparate your systems, the more labor effort it takes to manage them. And you
Wow.
think about all these little things that we go through and we do our analysis. If I can reduce my head count from a tech perspective and put process automation tools in place that aren't going to, and I don't want to say this in a negative way, they're not going to take vacation. I'm not going to have to worry about people getting sick and PTO and all that kind of jazz and benefits. And if I can put a tool in place, it's the best of both worlds. And it allows that firm to become more profitable in the long run. We've seen it. We've done it with firms over and over.
Yeah.
I agree. It eliminates the chaos. I say rip the Band-Aid off, and that's truly from an IT perspective. Just get it over with. Put forth the effort to bring it all together. You think about the process with M&A, and it's a dating process, right? You're getting to know one another.
Mhm.
And I don't ever want to discount the relationship aspect of this. A lot of great leaders come together, like a lot of great organizations come together, and it's a great fit. I think you're going to find that the seller is going to be somewhat resistant to want to give up their brand. They're proud of that, right?
Mhm.
But when you think of, that's when they need to come down, take their business owner's hat off, if you will, and come down at the departmental level and talk to those in finance. And since this is about IT today, talk to the IT personnel to find out what it's going to take to keep things separate and what it would look like if it was brought together. Just one quick example is the migration from on-prem to cloud, as I've referenced earlier. That's a potential. Microsoft offers the ability to go into somewhat of a hybrid arrangement, but Microsoft will also recommend that you don't stay in that hybrid situation for very long. You need to use that to get into the cloud, but get to the cloud as quickly as possible.
John, I'm going to throw another question your way. We mentioned earlier about how you and I have joined forces on some AE firm acquisitions where you've gone in and performed a technology assessment. But how about elaborating on that a little bit? How might someone like SN's technology group or another firm's technology group, how might they partner with an AE firm's internal technology team in preparing for an acquisition and planning for it and even helping with the integration?
I I think it's a great solution to outsource the effort to get an assessment performed. One, it's a third party set of eyes taking a look.
Mhm.
It's not skewed in any way, seller or buyer side. If a third party comes in and looks at both sides, that you're going to get an impartial analysis at that point. I think more importantly, does your IT staff have the capability of doing it? Maybe they're technically able to handle it, but do they have the time? Oftentimes, IT departments are running lean and mean.
You
Um,
guys aren't overstaffed. I thought IT was always overstaffed. No.
Rarely, and that's a discussion I have frequently. An organization might take a lot of pride in keeping things cost effective. Again, running it lean and mean, but how effective is that for the long haul? Is it sustainable? So now we're taking staff potentially that are in house.
Mhm.
We're throwing the possibility of a merger at them. We're asking them to figure that out while they're trying to keep the wheels on the cart in place, just to keep systems up and running on a daily basis, which could be a lift on and of itself, especially if they're understaffed. And through that process of outsourcing to a professional organization that could come in and do the analysis, certainly the IT staff will be relieved of that burden to try to figure things out. We always approach it with our own work as meeting them wherever they need us to meet them at. So they may or may not have an IT department. There's all kinds of different ways of looking at this, but if they have an IT department, through that interview process, getting to know the staff, a lot of times through the process, actually things are solved. Phil probably laughed because I often say I work myself out of a job from a consulting perspective. If we're doing our job, I shouldn't have much to do in the long run, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I've seen the work product that you've put out, and as a former CFO that was the C person responsible for IT at our firm, definitely see the value in it from the standpoint of you basically hand a document over that says, here's everything you need to know about this target firm that you're acquiring. And it's something that a buyer's internal IT team could take day one, know exactly what they need to do, when, what's the priorities, where are the major risks, and basically lays a roadmap out there on how to deal with it.
It's a
And
playbook.
to your point, IT generally doesn't have time to figure that out on their own. They've got their day jobs. They're taking care of the buyer's existing business. So I certainly see a great value in such a product. Hey, as we're closing out here, I want to throw a bone out to our potential sellers out there, because so much of this, when it comes to technology, a big part of this is really on the buyer and doing the due diligence on what they're acquiring. But from a technology perspective, what can a seller do to make themselves more marketable, or at least be better prepared to be acquired? Phil, let me throw that at you.
I alluded to it earlier. Process, right? Systems, reducing risk, security. If I were a seller, I would make sure that at the simplest level, hardware's try to keep the same platform. Software, you don't have a ton of software floating around out there that's only 25, 30% used. Evaluate your software stack and make sure that you're utilizing it and there aren't any frivolous spend, if you will, or software costs that aren't being fully utilized. Make sure you have a written system security plan, a business continuity, disaster recovery plan. If you have any compliance frameworks that you have to align with, make sure those are documented and you have a security system in place. And then make sure you have your recovery plan, your business continuity recovery plan vetted out. So all those things, and of course, dialing in and managing cost as well, right? There's a report out there that we use. The average organization, their total technology spend per individual through the course of the year is around $7,500 to $8,000 a year per employee should be a tech spend. So again, evaluating those things as well. They're good benchmarks or metrics to have in place. Focusing on process. I look at that anytime we come into an organization for onboarding. So John will know, and my team, my entire team, as soon as I say we have a customer now that we're in the process of onboarding, right? Onboard, the effective date starts January 1. And we're onboarding them. And the first thing my team asks me is do they have an RMM tool? Do they have a ticketing system? How are they managing certain processes? Do they have SaaS backup? Do they have cloud backup for virtual machines? How chaotic is it? How many tickets do they have? From a seller perspective, if you don't have those details to be able to answer in terms of the questions that are asked, for me, it's a red flag and just tells me it could be a little chaotic through the acquisition or the onboarding stage. So I'm going to buffer a little bit more time for onboarding because I know they probably don't have their act together.
John, anything you would add to that?
I think Phil touches on a lot of valid points individually. I mean, if you go through that list, I'd prefer not to maybe overwhelm anybody any further. So I'll dumb it down maybe a little bit to the point that I'll say, just get the assessment done. That's a good starting point. If you think you're going to be selling, have an assessment done as soon as possible. I prefer you to have the assessment done at least a year out. Give us time to work on it. If you're hiring somebody to come in and perform the assessment, make sure it's somebody that can actually take care of some of the items for you. Don't just have a professional consultant come in and do the consulting and uncover all these problems and flap that roadmap down in front of you, right? The plan, if you will, via the assessment, which is your playbook, and then let you stuck with it. Can they help you? If they can help you, have them work on some of this stuff. And again, you're looking at it from here's where we were, here's where we are, where can we get to, and how quickly can we get there? That's my take on it. Just be careful not to have an assessment done and then sit on it. Set actionable items to be tackled. I don't know how else to say that. Take action. There, that's how I want to say it. Take
Hey,
action.
I
Do it
understand.
now.
It makes sense to me. So, well, John, Phil, thank you so much for joining me today.
I appreciate it. Thank you for having us.
Yep. Thank you very much. I appreciate it too.
Well, thanks everyone for tuning in to AEC Unscripted, the Mergers and Acquisition edition. Again, I'm Jeff Adams, your host, and it's been a pleasure guiding you through M&A from the perspective of a couple of technology experts in the AEC industry. Please remember to subscribe and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. And until next time, keep pushing forward.